Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Phantom. I began my life as a freak exhibit with my hands and feet bound to the bars of the cage so that I could not hide my face from the prying multitude. My first appearance had been a disaster that produced something dangerously close to a riot when the angry crowd demanded their money back. They could see nothing because I cowered in a corner with my arms wrapped around my head. They insisted they had been cheated, and Javert, fearful of impending violence, promptly sent 2 men in the cage to bind me. I screamed and kicked and bit like a wild animal, but I was no match for the strength of 2 full-grown men. Within a few moments, I was secured with my arms at full stretch, like Christ on the cross, so that it would be impossible for me to turn my face from view. Javert entered the cage and tied a rope around my neck so that I was forced to lift my head from my chest. As my skull jerked back against the iron bar, I opened my eyes involuntarily and saw people stepping back in delighted horror. "Mother of God!" exclaimed a woman, pulling a screaming child into the shelter of her skirts. "Let us pass. For pity's sake, let us through." The crowd parted a little to allow to drag the hysterical infant away, but the other children had also begun to scream, and I could not take my eyes from their open, shrieking mouths. It was as though I had saw myself once more in the mirror, and shared with them all over again the horror of that first sight. But no horror could compare with that burning degradation, the unspeakable humiliation of this obscene exposure. Panic numbed all other sense, and I began to twist and pull like a frantic unbroken until the rope cut into my throat. "Look," someone shouted, "it's going to strangle itself." How disgusting! Such things should not be shown in public. A new ugliness was rapidly infecting the crowd. They had paid good coin to be titillated and entertained, not disturbed and discomforted. My raw anguish was offensive to some, and once more Javert was faced with angry demands to return the viewing fees. My cage was hastily withdrawn from view. I do not know how much money I cost him on that occasion, but I was sufficient to bring him a little later at the towering rage. He whipped me savagely for ruining his exhibition. But at that very moment, when blessed unconsciousness promised to embrace me, he cut me down from the bars and stood over me with his arms aggressively folded. "Well," he demanded coldly, "have you learned how to be silent now? Or do you need further course of instruction?" I lay at his feet, stared in disbelief at the huge wheels that were rising on my bare arms. My head spun, and there was blood in my mouth from where I bit my tongue. But there was only one thought in my head, only one desire. "Give me back the mask," I said. "What?" He stared at me curiously. "The mask," I repeated dizzily. "Give me the mask, please." Suddenly, without warning, Javert began to laugh, slapping his whip against his gross thigh, and then leaning forward to poke me with the crop. "Now you listen to me, you little corpse, and listen good. No one's going to pay to see a bloody mask, but half the women in France will swoon at the sight of your face. Don Juan himself could not have drawn more skirts in one afternoon. But I won't have any more of that cursed screaming, so be warned. You drive away any more customers as you did today, and it'll be a bad lookout for you. I'll flay every scrap of skin off of your miserable body if you ever behave like that again in public." I clenched my fist and stared at him in crazy defiance. "I won't be seen. I won't be stared at. I won't. Surely he would kill me now. He would bring down his great fist and smash my suicidal impudence to pulp. I waited desperately for the end that would release me, but he did not strike again. Instead, he regarded me thoughtfully, as though he measured every lesion on my body and waited against the time when I could be exhibited once more. "I suppose I could always gag you," he mused to himself. It's that bloody screaming that does the harm. Makes the women jumpy. And spooks the crowd. Yes, I think I'll gag you next time. A beating soon forgotten, but a gag will put an end to your defiance once and for all. Next day we moved on. I did not know where we were going, nor did I care. Time and place had ceased to have any meaning for me, but he kept his promise. The next time I was exhibited, I was gagged and bound in an upright coffin, in a position where it was physically impossible for me to do myself harm. I was silent now, and this time no one complained or wanted their money back. I was an enormous success, Javert told me with satisfaction when he came that night to feed me like a trained dog. When I had learned to be sensible, he would remove the gag and permit me to earn my keep with a little more comfort. I watched him put the key to the lock in his pocket and walked away, whistling cheerfully, and thought how much I hated him, how I wished he were dead. The wind whistled around the bars of my cage that night as I lay listening to the camp dogs barking intermittently and hating. But hating could not keep me warm. Long before the campfires burned out, I laid in the coffin flat on the floor, crept back into its narrowness for shelter, and I fell asleep. The gag defeated me, as Javert known it must. His violence and cruelty concealed an innate shrewdness, a crude, instinctive sort of wisdom that showed him new and more subtle ways to conquer rebellion. It wasn't before long I came to accept that I was only adding to my suffering by my own stubbornness. I thought my flesh still crawled with revulsion when the crowds pressed around my cage. I learned to display the silent indifference of a dumb animal. That was what they wanted, what they came to see. An animal, an oddity, a thing. Increasingly, I ceased to feel that I belonged to what is loosely termed the human race. It was as though I had stumbled onto some alien planet where I had found myself unable to take revenge upon my tormentors, except in the dark prison of my mind. There, in that uniquely private domain, where I was free of change, I conjured 1,000 horrible deaths for those who came to prod and stare. I learned to live almost entirely in my mind, creating a landscape of my own and peopling it with devices of my captive imagination. My world was strange and beautiful, an entirely new dimension where music and magic held sway. It was a second Eden, where I alone was God, and at the times I retreated so far into it that I became indeed a living corpse, comatose and trance-like, scarcely breathing. And yet, however far I was retreated, there was always some part of me that was bitterly aware of reality. My mobile prison jolted me across the length and breadth of France, from one fair to another, and I was kept in conditions of animal squalor until I feigned sufficient obedience and resignation to suggest that my spirit was entirely broken. Humility was the price of these moments of privacy which basic human dignity demands. My mother taught me to conduct myself like a gentleman, to be fastidious in my person and courteous in my demeanor. I could not bear to live like an animal. I begged to be allowed out of the cage, to attend matters that demanded privacy. And this request so amused Javert, that mannerless pig, that he came to release me in prison and stand guard over my ablutions with his pistol. I knew if I made any attempt to escape, he would shoot. Not to kill. I was too valuable to exhibit for that, but to maim sufficiently to ensure that I should not get far before he caught me. When I demanded clean clothes, he laughed out loud and told me he had never known a corpse so particular about its shroud. "You'll be wanting a dress suit next," he sneered. "Quit your bleeding. You draw enough crowds as you are." I turned very slowly and looked at him. "I could draw more," I said, driven by desperation to hold sudden boldness. "I could draw twice as many people, if you made it worth my while." He lowered his pistol and beckoned me nearer. His instinct was to mock, but his own inherent greed made him curious. "What blather is this?" he demanded cautiously. "You're the most ugly creature that ever walked God's earth. That's your livelihood and my good fortune. Why else would anyone want to pay to see you?" "If you place lilies in the coffin with me," I said slowly, "I could make them sing."